So we are going to hear the presentation entitled All for One, Conceptual Framework, Cross-Cultural Differences and Approaches to the Unified European Knowledge Panel from Depraetere. I hope I was close.
It's okay. It's good enough, let's say.
Joke is a criminologist and sexologist who finished her PhD in criminology just last year. That's exciting. She has extensive knowledge of representative sampling, piloting complex statistical data analysis methods, and the development of high-quality databases. During her career, she has published in a number of peer-reviewed international journals and has regularly presented at various international conferences. She's currently working as a senior research expert at the Ipsos EU Research Methods Center, where she supports the development of the European Knowledge Panel. Go ahead.
All right, thank you for the introduction. Just figuring out how I need to place you all so I can have a look. I might not look straight into the camera because you're a bit different on my screens, but I hope this works. So I'll be talking today a bit about the European Knowledge Panel, and I'll be focusing on some of the challenges we faced when setting up a cross-national panel throughout Europe. So I'll first give you some background of what Knowledge Panel actually is about, and then I'll dive into the conceptual framework and then the methodological framework, and then give you an overview of where we're at with Knowledge Panel currently. Yes, all right. So what is Knowledge Panel? So Knowledge Panel is an online probability-based panel where we use random selection of the general population for recruitment. And it actually has a long history in the US as well, where Knowledge Panel in the US was launched more than 2 decades ago, so in 1999. And currently they have approximately 60,000 active panelists. So it's one of the largest panels also in the US with over 2,000 profile variables. And in 2020, the Knowledge Panel in the UK was launched, where they have currently approximately 25,000 active panelists. And then in 2021, we started with the preparations of launching Knowledge Panel in Europe. And in the summer of 2022, we launched it in the first countries and are still launching as we speak in other countries in Europe. So Knowledge Panel Europe has some of 8 core elements, and you can see them here on the slide. I'll go over the slide fairly quickly because some of these topics will be covered again later on in the presentation. So first off, the random probability sampling design. So we only apply strict random probability sampling methods to recruit panelists into the panel, and also for sampling for specific surveys. The coverage elements, we aim for a high coverage in each of the sampling strategies that we apply and really focus on fully working the samples to allow also the late responders to join the panel. Thirdly is the inclusion of the hard to reach. So with Knowledge Panel, we aim to give a voice to everyone, the low income, low educated, youth, elderly, but also particularly the digitally excluded or non-internet households, which is something that I will talk a bit more about in this presentation as well. The push to web recruitment. So we focus on surveys are online. So we focus on a push to web recruitment to minimize differential mode effects. The fifth is the fast data collection. So overall fieldwork takes approximately 2 weeks, and we return data within a week of fieldwork ending. And now in the future, this may actually go down to 1 week of fieldwork, which really also depends on the sizes of the panel, which can vary across the various countries in Europe. The extensive panelist profiling. So overall, we aim to have an extensive profile of demographic and geodemographic variables. And at the start of launching Knowledge Panel in the countries, we have a set of profiling variables, which I'll also detail more later on. And this will grow as we speak in the panels once they're launched and like live for a longer time. The quality assurance. So we have a quality approach and a quality framework where we really want to focus on keeping the panel health high and the panel quality overall. So we really focus on minimizing respondent fatigue and attrition and make sure that panelists are not over-researched or conditioned. And then finally, the high survey completion rates. We focus now on having a response rate of approximately 50% or higher And so we really monitor this also by looking at the quality, attrition, and various quality aspects that are detailed in the quality framework. So this is just to give you a bit of an idea of what Knowledge Panel Europe is about. And so now I'll talk a bit more about the conceptual framework. So I mentioned already that in launching Knowledge Panel Europe, we have applied various recruitment strategies. But in this aspect, the conceptual framework, I'm focusing on the uniform approach that we applied, the standardization across all the countries to really allow for cross-national comparability. So specifically, I'm talking here about the fact that we use one recruitment method, one profiling questionnaire, and a similar platform, an identical platform actually, one look and feel, and a similar definition of the offliners. So practically in the first stage, we use a similar approach across all the countries, but of course, local translations. And we only allowed essential variables to be added to the profiling questionnaire that were really needed locally for representativity checks. So there we really want to balance out between the length of the survey on the one hand, the risk of dropout when the length increases, and the local needs. And then in the second stage, additional profiling questionnaires can be launched within the country among the panelists who have already enrolled. So this is referring back to what I mentioned earlier. We have a basis of profiling questionnaires or profiling variables, and that can be added locally within each country. So there, the cross-national aspect is less visible because it's really the country themselves that focus on what variables are needed. So we also keep in mind that we want to keep respondents' burden low when participating in Knowledge Panel, especially because there might be many people who are not used to taking surveys or who are not used to doing online research in general. So we really want to make sure that when they join Knowledge Panel, it's a fun experience, and that we really hold to the word what we say that Knowledge Panel is actually about. So when we recruit people into Knowledge Panel, we mentioned that the topics that they will answer in surveys are about current affairs, national and local issues, about healthcare, and so on. So really focus on their opinions to change policy locally, nationally, and so on. So it's really those topics that we aim for in Knowledge Panel. Another aspect is, of course, the mobile-friendly aspect. So a lot of the panelists complete the surveys via their mobile phone. So making it mobile-friendly is really an important aspect to look into when we design the surveys. And with all this, I also want to point to the fact that when we created the recruitment and profiling questionnaire, we really wanted to make sure that their first experience, because this is the first questionnaire they actually fill in on the panel, is a fun experience. So there we already made a selection of various topics that are in line with what we mentioned that they will fill in Knowledge Panel, and a variation of kind of questions they would actually encounter when being a panelist on Knowledge Panel. So grid questions, Likert scale questions, multiple choice questions. It's a variation of all these types of questions in the first questionnaire, so they kind of have a feeling of what Knowledge Panel would be about. So here is an overview of the panel profile. This is grouped together into 5 main topics: personal and household characteristics, media and technology, values and attitudes, employment and financial variables, and then health and lifestyle. So these are really the aspects that are similar across the countries where we can do cross-national comparabilities. And these variables are actually based on Eurostat data on the European Social Survey. And we also gathered some information from the UK Knowledge Panel questionnaire to really see on what works there and how they phrase their questions to have an evidence based on that we have the best experience also in European Knowledge Panel. In terms of additional local variables, so what I mentioned before, it's only the essential ones. So for example, voting behavior in some countries are really essential to have this variable as well in the profiling questionnaire to have some representativity checks. And employment status, where there's a bit of a difference in how we have to ask about employment status. So we'll also have national comparability with the official statistics. So those are the type of questions that are added to the recruitment and profiling questionnaire in the first stage. All right, so the offliners. I mentioned this before. It's in knowledge panel. It's an important aspect to actually include the offliners or the digitally excluded in the panel, because it's really a part of having complete coverage of the population, because they tend to have a different profile in terms of age, employment, educational level compared to the onliners. So not including them in the panel can actually cause a bias in terms of what research questions we have in surveys on the panel. But it turns out that defining them correctly or identifying them correctly is quite challenging, especially when we have a cross-national setup. So overall, we have a definition that is threefold, which I show here on the slide. So offliners are defined as those who do not have internet at home via any device, or are very uncomfortable using the internet other than for email and social media, or have no personal email address. So the last one is actually an important aspect, because to be able to join Knowledge Panel, you need to have a personal email address, because it's linked to your panel platform, and your survey invites will also be directed to one personal email address. So there were some households, for example, that mentioned they had a shared email address. So it actually is impossible for them to join the panel separately, because when we send out an invitation, we don't have the guarantee that the correct person is actually filling out the survey. So they might actually have internet or be comfortable using it, but still be identified as an offliner. So join the panel via in a different way. And the second definition here, so the comfort of using the internet, turned out to be a difficult question to interpret for the panelists. So in the beginning, we noticed that the profile of some of the offliners was not really matching with the profile we had in mind in terms of age. So they were young. They used the internet actually relatively frequently. So we called these people back to actually ask them how they interpreted the question. And it turned out that they mostly focused on the safety of the internet instead of their internet skills. So we added a note to this question to really clarify that we aim to assess internet skills and not particularly the safety of the internet, to already address some of the misinterpretations in the question. But it turns out there's still some challenges related to defining the offlines correctly. And this is shown on this slide here. So this is an overview of the first 4 countries that were live in Knowledge Panel. And I'm comparing here the onliners versus the offliners. So the onliners are the green bars and the offliners are the blue bars. So overall, what we see is that there is a difference in terms of their profile and the frequency of using the internet, where the onliners mostly use it all the time, around once a day, and whereas the offliners, their frequency is kind of spread out across the various options here. But what we also see is that there are differences across the countries. And especially when we look at Sweden, the difference in the online versus offliner profile is actually not that clear cut. So they're really quite similar in terms of how frequently they use the internet. So how can we explain these differences? So on the one hand, it could be related to language differences, where the translations locally might lead to slight different interpretations on how they interpret a question about using the internet and the comfort of using the internet and so on. It might also be related to cultural differences. So for example, on the one hand, social desirability might be an issue here, that some people might not want to admit that they're not comfortable using the internet, or that their ability of using the internet is relatively low. Or on the other hand, it could be related to internet penetration. So for example, in Italy and Poland, internet penetration is close to 80%, sometimes a bit lower. Whereas in Sweden, internet penetration is close to 100%. So there, the difference in the profile between onliners versus offliners might not be that different as a basis. And finally, it might also be related to differences in the recruitment methods. Because in France, Italy, and Poland, we used a random digit dialing for the recruitment of the panelists into the panel, whereas in Sweden, we used address-based sampling. And of course, when you have an interviewer present who can actually clarify the question, it can have a different effect on identifying the offliners. Just as a side note here, what I want to add is that the use of the internet is actually generally, so also media and social media and email use, for example, whereas these are the two aspects that we actually excluded from the definition of the offliner. So just keep that in mind a bit. All right, that brings me to the next aspect about the methodological framework. So overall, there are various challenges of building a knowledge panel or a cross-national knowledge panel. So it obviously has several advantages, but it also comes with challenges, particularly with regards to the variability between the countries. So I grouped them together into three main challenges. The first one being differences in the sampling frames. So across the countries, we have a lot of differences in what sampling frames are available and the coverage within each of these sampling frames. Then there's the laws and regulations locally. So there are differences in what kind of recruitment method we can actually apply in some countries and the profile of the people that we can actually recruit. So for example, the 16 to 18-year-olds is quite challenging to recruit in Poland, where you need parental consent for them to enter the panel. So that age group is really difficult to get into the panel. And then finally, the cultural and behavioral norms. So there's differences in the language spoken, which can lead to different interpretation in terms of the questions or translations. And also an important one, of course, what works in one country may not work in another one in terms of what kind of invitation message you use, what kind of images you use, and so on. So overall, these aspects may actually increase the risk of coverage error, where it may vary across the countries, the mode effects and the instrument effects. So a cross-national research or a cross-national setup requires an extra layer of work with detailed guidelines and standards to ensure that there's no substantial differences in the applied methodology. And that's also something that we focused on, and I will talk about that in the next slides. But I also want to add here is that different sampling strategies across countries can actually lead to equivalent samples as long as you have a strict probability sampling design. So in terms of the standards and guidelines, we use a similar quality approach across the countries. And the quality approach that we use is a standardized maximum quality approach. So this means that we identify key aspects that can actually affect the cross-national comparability. And within each of these aspects, we describe some entry criteria or some minimum standards that have to be consistent across the countries. And within each of these standards, we then go and apply the best possible quality within each of the country, including the best possible data collection mode and so on. So on this slide, I'm providing an overview of those key aspects where we want to have standardization and also minimum standards in each of these aspects. So I'm not really sure about the time, but otherwise I'll focus on a couple of them.
I have about 1 minute to wrap up.
Okay, so I'll just focus on a couple of them. Okay, so the random probability aspects. So I mentioned this before, we have generally three recruitment methods that we apply. Postal recruitment, telephone recruitment, and then face-to-face recruitment. Now, within general, we actually have preference for postal recruitment in the first place. And there we have several criteria that we look into. So the first one being the sample frame needs to cover at least 90% of the population or higher. The sample frame must not be older than 1 year. It needs to include either individuals, households, or unique addresses. And then finally, the individuals or households included in the sample frame must not be fundamentally different compared to those not included, which really based on the information that we get from the sample frame. Is it commercial? What's the background? And so on. So if we're not able to access such a frame or the frames that are available do not meet these criteria, we go to another recruitment method, such as telephone recruitment, which in most cases is random digit dialing or face-to-face recruitment. All right, another aspect that I'll focus on here is the offliner population, because I mentioned this before. So of course, placing the tablets, which is something that we already heard about a bit in this conference. So some countries actually have the possibility to place tablets immediately, while others first go for telephone interviews. And so placing a tablet is not there's no clear answer to that in the first instance, because we balance out between the cost and feasibility on the one hand, but also on the internet penetration and on balancing out non-response and mode effects on the other hand. So non-response meaning that some of the offliners might actually only want to participate in the panel when surveys are provided by telephone. So only by giving them a tablet, we might actually lose them. And on the other hand, you have the mode effects that are actually minimized when you give a tablet to them. So placing a tablet has various advantages, but it also causes that you transfer the offliners to onliners, and therefore can also impact their behaviors and their attitudes, which is really the main thing that we actually want to measure in the panel in the first place. So just to say that there's always an ongoing discussion with the countries to look at what's the best quality and to balance out various aspects here. So then I'll move to the last slide to give you an overview of the current coverage of Europe. So in the green countries, those are the countries where we're live now. The orange ones are the ones where we're setting up or still discussing which sample frame to use, which method to use in general. So you'll see that the gray countries in the table on the left side are the ones where we use random digit dialing. And the white ones are the ones where we use address-based sampling, which varies from an individual address-based register in Germany or Sweden, to a household register in Netherlands, for example, and an address register, a unique address register in Spain. All right, so I think I'll just leave it here, and if there are any questions, I'll be happy to address them. I'll just also show my email. You can also reach out if you have any additional questions.